Ladies and gentlemen, we stand at the edge of a global turning point, one defined not by a distant threat, but by a choke point on the world map, whose ripple effects can reach every home, every economy, and every future plan we dare to make. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is not just a regional crisis, it is a global pressure point, one capable of triggering an energy shock unlike anything we've faced in decades. Imagine a world where fuel prices surge overnight, where supply chains buckle, where national security strategies are redrawn in real time, where economies scramble not for growth, but for energy survival. This is not a thought experiment. It is a scenario that could unfold with a single act of escalation, one strategic stranglehold that halts nearly a fifth of the world's oil flow. This moment demands clarity. It demands leadership, and above all, it demands urgency. Because the question is no longer, what happens if? The question is, what do we do now? Before the world changes faster than we can respond, strength is tested not during moments of abundance, but in the split second when something small proves it can change everything. The Strait of Hormuz is that small thing, a narrow passage capable of shifting global power, redirecting economies, and forcing both men and women to confront what stability truly means. For men, this kind of vulnerability often clashes with the internal need to appear unshaken, to project certainty even when the world's energy lifeline can be disrupted by a single geopolitical spark. For women observing this dynamic, it highlights an uncomfortable truth, that much of the world's security still hinges on how men respond under pressure, how they interpret risk, and how they balance the instinct to protect with the responsibility to think clearly. Pressure doesn't create character, it reveals it. And when a waterway like this becomes the center of global tension, it exposes how differently men and women perceive threat and responsibility. Men often process crises through the lens of duty, fueling a drive to act, to fix, to lead, even when the situation demands patience and strategic restraint. Women, on the other hand, frequently gauge the emotional and societal consequences, sensing the ripple effects that men might overlook in their urgency to restore control. Interdependence becomes undeniable the moment one nation's disruption becomes every nation's crisis. The world's energy network is not a loose collection of suppliers and buyers. It is an invisible chain where the tightening of one link, like a shutdown near the Strait of Hormuz, sends tension through every other link. Men often respond to this kind of interconnected pressure with an instinctual desire to isolate the problem, to find the single point of failure and fix it through force of will. Women observing this tendency often see a broader pattern, that nations behave much like individuals under stress, revealing their deepest insecurities when the flow of energy, the lifeblood of modern civilization, is threatened. Dependence becomes powerful only when we realize how little control we truly hold. As energy grids, trade routes, and geopolitical alliances stretch across continents, the psychology of men in leadership is pushed into a paradox. They want to command certainty in a world built on fragile cooperation. Women frequently recognize the emotional undercurrent of this dynamic, understanding that when men feel the weight of global responsibility, they often mask fear with decisiveness. The invisible chain of energy doesn't only bind nations, it exposes the human tendencies beneath political decisions, especially in moments when stability hangs on forces no one leader can fully contain. Impact becomes real, not when headlines warn of crisis, but when everyday life begins to feel the strain. A disruption stemming from a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz is not just an energy issue. It's a chain reaction that reaches from fuel pumps to grocery aisles and kitchen tables. Men often process this as a direct threat to their ability to provide and protect, feeling the weight of responsibility intensify as prices rise and resources tighten. Women, watching this shift, often sense the emotional pressure behind the practical one, recognizing that when men feel their role is compromised, their confidence can erode long before the shelves empty. Stress spreads faster than scarcity when essential systems begin to weaken. When energy costs spike, transportation slows, food production falters, and the security people take for granted becomes uncertain. Men in these moments may slip into problem solver mode, believing that swift action is the only antidote to vulnerability. Women frequently notice the unseen cost of this urgency, the silent fear behind the determination, the worry that admitting uncertainty might be seen as weakness. The real cost of disruption isn't just measured in dollars or shortages. It's measured in how deeply it tests people's sense of stability, identity, and control. Power shifts the moment energy stops being a commodity and becomes a bargaining chip. When control over resources like the Strait of Hormuz turns into leverage, nations begin to act less like collaborators and more like competitors circling a high-stakes table. Men in positions of authority often feel an instinctive pull toward dominance in these scenarios, interpreting geopolitical tension as a test of strength, resolve, and strategic superiority. Women watching this dynamic frequently see the emotional subtext, the fear of losing influence, the drive to assert certainty, and the IET anxiety that comes when global power balances start to tilt. Strategy changes when influence is defined, not by ideals, but by who controls the flow of energy. As nations posture, negotiate, and maneuver, the psychology of leadership becomes just as important as military or economic capability. Men may gravitate toward decisive gestures, sanctions, alliances, displays of force, believing that visible action signals control. Women often recognize the relational layers beneath these moves, understanding how ego, identity, and unspoken insecurities shape decisions that appear purely tactical on the surface. When energy becomes power, geopolitical games reveal far more than national interests. They expose the human instincts driving leaders as they navigate a world where power can shift with the turn of a valve. Strength is never proven by standing firm in one place. It's proven by having the ability to adapt when the ground shifts beneath you. Diversifying energy pathways is not just a technical strategy. It is a psychological safeguard against the fragility exposed when too much power sits in a single choke point like the Strait of Hormuz. Men often internalize this vulnerability as a challenge to their role as protectors, pushing them toward bold solutions that promise stability. Women observing this response often pick up on the emotional intensity behind it, recognizing that the drive to create alternatives stems not only from strategic thinking, but from a deeper desire to shield others from uncertainty. Security becomes sustainable only when the systems behind it are flexible, layered, and not dependent on a single source. As energy markets fluctuate and geopolitical pressures rise, the mental load on men in leadership positions often increases. They feel the expectation to anticipate threats, provide solutions, and maintain control even when volatility makes those dim. And nearly impossible to meet. Women frequently notice the internal conflict this creates, understanding how the desire to mitigate risk can also amplify stress when the stakes feel personal and national at the same time. Resilience is built the moment diversification stops being an option and becomes a necessity. When nations invest in multiple energy routes, renewable technologies, and broader supply networks, they reduce not only external vulnerabilities, but also the psychological pressure placed on individuals tasked with safeguarding stability. Men, who often tie their identity to their ability to respond decisively in crisis, benefit from systems that don't rely on constant vigilance. Women, attuned to the emotional ripple effects of instability, recognize that diversified pathways create a sense of collective security that supports stronger decision-making. Urgency becomes real the moment leaders realize that waiting is no longer a strategy, but a liability. In a world where the closure of the Strait of Hormuz can trigger a global energy shock within hours, leadership is defined not by who responds the fastest, but by who anticipates the consequences before they materialize. Men in leadership roles often feel this as a visceral pressure, a call to act decisively, assert control, and demonstrate strength even when information is incomplete. Women observing this instinct often recognize the deeper psychological tension beneath it, the fear of appearing passive, the struggle between caution and boldness, and the internal battle between rational planning and the emotional weight of responsibility. Decisions become heavier when volatility turns every choice into a potential turning point. As disruptions escalate and global systems stretch to their limits, men frequently default to action-driven leadership, believing momentum itself can counter uncertainty. Yet women often pick up on the hidden toll this takes, how urgency can blur judgment, heighten frustration, and create an emotional fatigue masked by determination. They see that behind every commanding decision is a human being wrestling with doubt, identity, and the burden of protecting those who depend on them. Courage becomes essential, not because the future is dangerous, but because hesitation allows danger to grow. In an era defined by energy instability, geopolitical friction, and economic vulnerability, leadership requires the ability to choose direction before circumstances force the choice. Men often interpret this as a test of their capacity to stay steady under pressure, to embody confidence for others even when their own footing feels uncertain. Women often understand that the true measure of strong leadership lies in balancing urgency with emotional awareness, recognizing that effective action requires clarity, not just decisiveness.